everyone, and welcome to Satisfying Software. Today, I have with me Laïla Bougriâ, and she is a solution architect with nearly 20 years of experience in the industry. She focuses mainly on distributed systems with messaging. Welcome.
Oh,
So, let's start with the big opening question for you. Microservices were going to be the answer to all our problems with monoliths, but it seems that microservices are also getting a bad reputation. Why is that?
that's a very interesting question. Well, I think it has a lot to do with the sort of premise that microservices brought. It was like, oh, we're going to have all these small units that become a lot easier to understand, that are more concise, that have a lot less complexity in them, right? And that's the idea. That's the goal of building a microservice-based architecture. However, what people tend to forget in that picture is that you haven't really removed all of the complexity. You've just sort of moved it, right? You've moved it into how do these services communicate with each other? How do they interact with each other? So you've just kind of taken the same issues that we had before, but moved them and actually introduced additional complexity, because now in many cases there's a network in between and there's more latency, and we have different types of infrastructure that are now sort of integrating with each other. We don't have distributed transactions like we had in our sort of monolithic environment. So actually we've introduced a lot more complexity, if you will, with that type of architecture.
Yeah, I often like if I look at my clients, it's like, oh, we're going to go to microservices because or we have a monolith and it's a big ball of mud. And then when I look at sort of the architecture, what they have is a distributed big ball of mud, which I always say is the worst position to be in as having an architecture in your company. So you say that it's all in the communication now. And I think the most popular one is event-driven architecture there. I find that name not so nice. Because I prefer messaging, as you say, you're specialized in messaging, because people always think that event-driven architecture will just send out events and that's where it ends. Do you
Right.
have a similar experience?
Yes, I actually fully agree with that statement, because the thing is that even if you have a sort of event-driven architecture, according to, the terms that are being used in the industry, in any sort of application, you will still have some commands that you're sending out as well. They could be within a service boundary or across service boundaries. That's besides the point, but you will still have that. And what I've actually seen is that the whole idea around event-driven architecture will force people to do things like, oh no, but I need to have events everywhere, right? So they start to write these passive aggressive events, which is basically an event that actually has expectations about who's subscribed, what will happen, how they will respond, which is a command in disguise, right? I always make jokes about this when I sort of present this as an analogy. My husband always cooks at home, right? And the idea is that given that he does all of that effort, I will clean up the kitchen, right? That's sort of our agreement, if you will. But there are some of these days that I go into the kitchen and it's like a bomb exploded. It's like, every pot and pan is like dirty. And at that point, I could publish an event stating that the kitchen is messy. And it doesn't even sort of feel wrong, because, I mean, it's a fact. It's something that has happened, right? The state that the system has arrived to. But the problem is in the expectations, right? I expect him to be subscribed, to be listening to me, which is the first problem to begin with. And then I also expect him to react in a way that aligns with my expectations. I want him to come and help me clean up, right? So I use that as an example because it's funny, we can all sort of relate to that. And we know how that communication is not really very healthy for your relationships. But the same is true for your systems, right? You want to make those expectations explicit by saying, no, I'm actually sending you a command. Please do this. And then you can sort of deal with, okay, what if it hasn't happened, and think about SLAs and things like that. Or like, what if it's handled, but not in the way that you wanted to initially, like, for example, because the user already exists or something like that. So that allows you a lot more flexibility to make that coupling type of
Yeah,
explicit.
I always say it's also about domain knowledge leakage. So do I send a command or an event? And for me, it's like who has the right to take that decision? If we look at the microservices, like who can decide? Like in a simple example, if we say that we have an order and we just send out order finished, and we have a payment service, and then they're supposed to respond to that event, like it does not really make sense to me, because deciding whether or not it's time for payment is something that belongs to an order. They have all that information, they know. So it makes more sense to just send a command to payment and say, hey, it's now time for payment. Do it. So, but I often get the impression it's an all or nothing. Either we send out all events and we have message buses and we do all of that and we're fully event driven, or we work with APIs, technically speaking, and we send out commands and we call posts to other APIs and that kind of stuff. So how do you start deciding like what should be where and what is the best approach, command or event or?
Right. So I try to think a lot about the intent. And in that context, the sort of logical service boundary or the bounded context, if we're speaking DDD terms, tends to be very helpful, right? Because you could, in essence, have multiple microservices that are part of that same bounded context or logical service boundary. And within those boundaries, it is actually quite likely that you would be sending a command, right? There are scenarios where I've seen that, you can even do that across service boundaries. So always less optimal, but there are situations, the real world is messy, as I always say, right? So there are situations in which that can make sense, according to the circumstances and the state of the project that it may find itself in. But it's more about, clarifying what intent do I have here? What are my expectations when I send this out? And depending on those expectations, you can sort of start to see, like, I don't care about this. I just want to notify the system. Whoever is interested, well, that's up to them. When that's your perspective from the context of that bounded context, right? It's like you have to keep that in mind, because across system, this is a question that I get a lot. Yes, you can say that when you send a when you publish an event that you don't really care about who subscribes. But in the context of the entire system, of course you care. And I'm like, yes, of course you do, because you want all of the pieces to eventually click together, especially if you have a sort of choreographed flow. But then you're zooming out. So when you zoom in to the context of a single bounded context or a logical service boundary, and you say, okay, I do not care which other sort of context or service does something with this, then you have an event. Then it's just like, I'm notifying this. I wouldn't even know who would be interested in that. Then you have a valid event. If you're like, no, I want that service to do something with this and then respond, that's where you have a command. So it's a lot about trying to look into those semantics and splitting it. And it's a bit, tricky in the beginning, but practice makes perfect.
I hope so, because I've been doing it for a while and I think I'm getting better at it. No, I still mess up sometimes, though. Yes.
Absolutely. Me
Like one
too.
of the habits early on in my career is that I made all my events public. And then what you get is a lot of small events that becomes very hard to change because you don't know who's depending on it anymore. And I kind of was very relieved to hear about summary events, to be honest. It's like, oh, I don't have to make everything public.
Right. This is actually an angle that I will be covering in one of the talks that I'm working on right now, which will be about, versioning event-driven systems, right? Is that the first step to set yourself up for success is to differentiate between what is private and what is public. So what is private to your service boundary or bounded context, and what is public outside of that. And the more public you go, the less you want to share, the more careful you want to be about the data that you're exposing. And again, I always compare this to the photo that you post of yourself at a drunken party on Facebook. Like, You can't undo that. Once it's like public, you can't really take it away. It starts to live its own life. Other services start to use that data, depend on it, manipulate it, maybe republish it. I mean, like once you publish it, it's out of your control. So that's definitely one of the first things is to differentiate like what the amount of granularity is probably going to be much higher within a context because all of the other sort of microservices that are participating within that bounded context share that understanding of what those things mean. Outside of that, much less so.
So you mentioned versioning. Let's get a sneak peek at the talk you're preparing. I have very little experience with versioning myself. What would be some of the 3 things that you should do when you're versioning?
Right. Well, the first one we kind of already discussed. It's differentiating what is private, what is public, how do I want to sort of constrain that and make sure that I'm not sharing too much because then making it private again is kind of hard and you're breaking all of your consumers at that point. The second part is also thinking about a compatibility strategy. So let's say that you are a producer of events, then you have to start thinking about your consumers. And okay, you may not know who they are, but you will have a sort of general understanding, zoomed out of, this is still within sort of my system, and my system is handled within my organization, and my organization are 40 people, let's say. Or, okay, my organization is like 15,000 people, and right, there's like so many teams. Those contexts are really different. So depending on the exposure of your events in the sort of system-wide picture, you have to sort of think of, okay, if I'm going to change this thing, how is it going to affect my consumers? And that's where you can start thinking about compatibility strategies. For example, saying, I want this to be backward compatible, forward compatible, fully compatible. And I'd rather you not say not compatible. But I guess that's an option,
No
right?
breaking changes.
That would Right. So that would be the second part. So when you say that you're backward or forward compatible, depending on the strategy, you'd say, okay, now you can add optional fields or whatever, right? Which is not breaking to consumers. There will be cases in which you will have to break, which, because even though we may pay a lot of attention at how we sort of design things, like our businesses evolve, and that's a good thing, or we'd be out of a job, right? I keep saying that. Like, yes, it causes friction, but it's also keeping us here and helping us sort of like evolve these systems. When you do that, we are talking about a different event. Like if you've completely broken the sort of data structure that you are sharing, that contract, then we're talking about a completely different event. Now, this is also where I talk about sort of how schema registries can help, where you have a centralized schema registry where you're saying, I have my endpoint, it exposes these types of events. This is the compatibility strategy that you can expect, right? And where you can also, for example, start saying, okay, if I deprecate this event, this is the one that supersedes it, and things like that. So you make that centrally available and discoverable as well.
So when you say about backwards compatibilities, what I sometimes noticed, mostly on API endpoints there, is but that there's this thing like we have to have backwards compatibility forever. Okay? So how long do you think, like if you have backwards compatibility, how long should you do support that?
Well, I would say as long as possible. Yes, I tend to agree with like the intent should be forever. However, like I said, once your system evolves in a way that the event basically changes completely in meaning, then you have a completely new event. So you also don't want to sort of hijack your producers that they're now forced to publish events V1, V2, V3, V4, whatever, until the end of time, because that would also cause an unmaintainable mess, right? And sometimes it's not even fully possible, or it requires you to go through crazy hoops and then with all of the negative effects on that code base. So one of the things that I like to compare this whole thing with is when you sort of sign a contract with whomever that is, right? When you sign a contract, you're basically making a promise, but you're putting your money where your mouth is, right? You're signing a paper. It's not just like, yes, we agreed, we're going to do this for sure, and then later you turn around and it's like breaking change. No. The idea is that you have that schema registry as a sort of like a contract, like a thing that enforces it, even for you. But of course, when you say, okay, but like the situation has entirely changed and we want to evolve, then what do we do in real life? We renegotiate, right? There might be an amendment to that contract, which is exactly what this is, which entails notifying, hey, there's this new thing that is coming up. You could even do that in a proactive manner. Much like we, in APIs, we would, for example, mark something as deprecated with warning, right? You get a warning, it's not gone, it still works, but at least you're getting that heads up of, hey, this is going to change in the future, get ready. Right, so it's when you compare that to Semver, it's a little bit like that. It's like, okay, first signaling there's a change coming up, and then saying, okay, when is this change going to be enforced? By when will this be deprecated? And then what do I use instead to allow all of your consumers to evolve? I mean, it's important to realize that the events in an event-driven architecture are the API of our system.
But it makes a lot, like if it's the API in our system, but in API you have this, you go to your code base and there's this nice little place where you can check all of that. With an event-driven architecture, that becomes a hell of a lot more difficult. How do you make it easier to see what are my contracts, what are my interfaces?
Right, so that's exactly also what a schema registry does, right? It gives you a centralized place where producers will say, you know, these are the events that I'm exposing, and any consumer could go there, centralized place, and see, okay, what are the events that are available? Are they going to be deprecated? By when will they be deprecated? What will be the next event that supersedes the previous one that was deprecated? And it gives you this central place that you can go to and then understand what should the schemas of these events be. And that's actually the whole idea. There's actually now also a standardization effort happening around this, because there are schema registries already out there like Confluent, and for event hubs you have a schema registry also built in, and there are many other options. But now there's under the CNCF a standardization effort happening under X registry, which I've recently also started to get involved with, and that's why I've been sort of digging into this topic more. And yeah, and it's really exciting to see where that's going, because then we'll get sort of also the same sort of guarantees of how a schema registry behaves across any vendor that you may use, right? Which is one of the common problems that we have in our software industry.
What are you talking about? Documenting is not a problem at all in our industry.
Of course, it's so straightforward.
When you were saying all of that, and I was like, oh, that's very nice. I hope there are tools to automate this, at the very least partially automate this, because we're not good at documentation.
Right. I'm actually hoping and seeing, like now with this standardization effort, how it opens up the ability to also, for example, step away from shared code packages for contracts and stuff like that, where you could even say, look, I'm going to go to the schema registry, I'm going to use this version of this event and just generate schemas out of that. You don't even really need to write the code anymore. So it's going to become a lot less brittle, because, you know, it's not exposed to our mistakes anymore, right? A lot of people sort of engage in contract-based testing, which I think can be valuable, but I can also see how schema registries fill a bigger hole there as well. And yeah, it's also going to make that a lot more easier, because you can also add a bunch of metadata. You can add descriptions to those events. So part of it also becomes kind of living documentation, if you will. And when it comes to sort of enforcement of those things, I'm also kind of hoping that maybe like over the rainbow, when you publish an event to a broker, right, and you've somehow told the broker, yeah, okay, this is the schema registry that I want you to use and enforce, that if you publish an event that is not backwards compatible, when you promised it would be backwards compatible, that it's going to reject your event. and say, no, I'm not going to let you publish this event because you promised backwards compatibility. This is not backwards compatible. And therefore, it would be a poison message, right, for your consumers.
Oh, that would be nice, like the broker as an enforcer of your contracts.
I mean, it would be nice. This is like hypothetical, right? We'll have to wait and see how these things evolve. But at least, like the least that I assume that is that there will be an ability to do client-side enforcement, to say as a client, as a client of the registry, if you will. So as a producer, you could say, hey, this is the schema registry that I'm using. This is the event payload that I want to publish. And that you could then use the schema registry to say, hey, does this make sense before I go ahead and publish it? And if yes, you can publish it. If no, well, you go and fix things, right? So that's something that I think by definition will be possible. But what would be the step further is to have this automatically enforced, which would just be awesome,
Yes, that
right?
would be brilliant. So we've mostly been talking about the less pleasant things about event-driven architecture. So what makes it worth it to go for an event-driven architecture?
That's a terrific question. Well, actually, one of the things that I enjoy a lot about building these types of systems is that my goal is always to align the system's behavior with what's happening in the outside world. And I know this aligns a lot with DDD, but an event-driven architecture allows you to express things in a way so that they best align. And I tend to enjoy that because, from a very early age, when I was just starting as a software engineer, I was always sort of this person that was always asking the annoying questions, and everyone was like, oh, stop asking all of these questions. And there was definitely a time where I thought like I was irritating or difficult or whatever. And I've realized that it's definitely one of my
Yes.
strengths now later. But yeah, I had this curiosity about why do they want this? How do they work? And how does that make sense? And I try to also make a sort of point of it if I start somewhere new in a completely new domain is can I shadow the people that are using this application? Like, what's their behavior? How do they use the system? Because we have so many assumptions about how we think they use the system, but how do they actually use the system? How do they execute their day-to-day work? And to then align our system, not only the language, but the behavior and all of those interconnections with that sort of real life behavior. I think that's really
Yeah,
powerful.
I totally agree with that. I also like when a lot of people they go for all the, oh my God, that's, it's so much more complicated. You don't know this. Yeah, so they often, our brains just work like that. We see the negative things a hell of a lot easier than the positive things. And I always say that, but you have experienced this in life. Like anytime you order a package, I mean, they put it in the mail, it goes to this mail office. I said, they're doing the exact same thing with your package and it arrives in your bus eventually. So we can do that in our software system as well. It is just an event is like an envelope that you just ship around, and we're okay with that. This is nothing new to you. It's just that now it's going to be in software. And we have, we have tracking numbers on packages, so we can have sort of tracking there as well to make everything easier for you. But it is true that, in real life, most of it is not synchronous. You don't get this and an answer and then everything goes like that. Most of it pretty much happens async.
Yes, I would agree like fully. I think real life is asynchronous. And actually, whenever like this is one of the things that I cover in my workshops as well, where people are like, yeah, but I mean, like how would I do this? And it has to like immediately work. And people, this is an assumption. This is also an assumption that's sort of like enforced over years of building synchronous communication based systems, right? But what I always try to sort of ask people is, okay, imagine that there was no system. Like there are no computers. There are no computers. right? What would happen? Like, oh, but I have to update my stock immediately after an order is placed or after it is shipped or whatever sort of the business requirements are. And people tend to sort of chase that consistency, if you will. So I'm like, okay, step away from that. Like, imagine that there is no system. You have a huge like store, no computer system, and people are just coming in, and you have multiple queues and multiple people who are working in the store, grabbing stuff from the stock and doing things with that. How would that work? And that usually causes this, So I think that works really well to force people to sort of step outside the synchronous assumptions, if you
Yeah, and
will.
it's true, right? I mean, you go to you're gonna buy shoes, and you go, do you have that in my size? And they're like, well, go check in the back, and either you come back with yes, we have them, or we'll put in an order, and you'll have to wait, and your software system can do the exact same thing.
Yeah. And even within that context of the store, it could be that they look into the system and they say, oh, yeah, we should have them. And they go to the back and they're like, I'm sorry, like we don't have them. And it could be that someone else is trying them on at the same time, right?
Yeah.
Like these things happen in real life.
They do. I think, yeah, a warehouse or some sort of shoe store is a great analogy for explaining event-driven architecture as well. Okay. So what else? It's more like the real life, but I feel it when it comes to like how teams have to communicate, like it's less intense.
Yes. Yes. Well, under the assumption that you got the service boundaries right, right? That's always what I say. And it's actually a good way to validate that, right? Because when you get a lot of like cross-team meetings and cross-team sort of pollination, if you will, at some point, and people checking in with that team and that team, that shows coupling. So that's usually sort of something to keep in mind and to check in with like, why do we need so much, coordination with this other team? Well, usually that's because you have a lot of coupling also in the system. But when you don't, and when you try to take care of creating more loosely coupled connections there, then that allows more autonomy, not only in the system, but also across the teams and, their goals and what they're pursuing, instead of just like, okay, we're going to release this. And now we've pushed back 5 other teams' deadlines because we did this. But yeah, that still happens frequently, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's not easy getting those boundaries right. And often the only reason
Right.
to know is indeed when you push it to production and you see how everything changes and how the team function and how they need to talk to each other, and the feedback loops are just not always there either.
Yes. I always say it's like you need to be patient, because the thing is that we also come into an environment we don't know the business, right? And as much as we say it's important to talk and even work with your business stakeholders, not everyone has that opportunity. Now, I would say that if you start to build a system in which you don't have access to business stakeholders and you want to build it in an event-driven way, that's already a huge risk, right? Because you already know that you don't have sufficient access to your stakeholders. And then sometimes a monolithic approach, at least in the beginning, as you're trying to figure stuff out and how things click together, can provide you more flexibility to split things out later, because it's a lot more painful to do that in a sort of distributed context already. But it's important to try to say, like, I always say, like, we build, like, people build software for people. So unless we have access to the people for whom we build the software for, how can we build the right software? Like, it doesn't make sense, right? We can't just go off on paper. I keep repeating, like, one of the most successful projects that I worked on throughout my career was at a bank, where basically they took people who were, like, I worked on loans and mortgages and things like that, and they took people who had been selling loans and mortgages for years out in the open, and they actually sat with us, like, in the same physical environment as the software developers. And I just, like, if I had a question, I would turn around and ask them, right? So that's like the the over the rainbow best scenario that you can imagine. And I realize not everyone has that opportunity, but that's a constraint that you have to take in mind also when you make architectural decisions about your system. How's your view on that?
Um, I've worked in places where I had access and where I did not have access. I remember my first job. It was pretty standard. It right, someone from our team and someone from the customer got into a room, talked for hours, with a whiteboard, and then came us back and told us what to do. But that wasn't really working, and we pushed it to production, and then we spent weeks and weeks fixing everything. And so when the second part of that project sort of was enabled, I was like, I don't want to do this anymore. And I literally spent days on the work floor with the people who would use it, and start asking questions. Some of them were not happy about it. Because it does slow them down and it's not part of their job
Yes.
description, even though it's part of mine, I feel, to understand what they do, but them giving my time, their time is not that. But I had the CEO of that company was very supportive. He understood where we came from, and he was like, "Look, if you have to explain it 5 times to him for her to understand, you're going to have to, because else she can't program it into it, and it will be
Right.
horrible." So I was very happy about that. I think I got most, satisfaction out of my job if I saw the people as well. Feel this a bit lonely, I think, if you never see anyone who actually is using your software.
Yeah. And to your point, Heen, actually one of the things that I also always recommend when you're in an environment where people are more reluctant to spend their time with you is to try to also observe what they are doing. And sometimes what can happen is that you catch something that is suboptimal in their workflow, that you can help them improve, that you can help them automate, and then you're giving something back for their time,
Yes.
right? So you've helped them automate something somewhere that's made their life easier. Well, now they'll be a lot more likely to spend their time with you, not only out of gratitude, but also out of, that piece of sort of time gain that they had, they can now spend with you. So sometimes we also have to invest a little bit to take back a little bit of their time as well. It's a two-way street.
It is, and I think that's still missing a bit. Most of like it's they tell us what to do is often not like it's not nothing negative, but it's also what you're taught. Like people will give you business requirements and you will program that, and your job is to program. Um, but looking at but I have the knowledge on what we can do with software, and I always say that the people who use your software don't. Like they have no idea what you can and cannot solve for them. So try to find out what is their problems, what are their frustrations, and then tell them like, hey, we can actually help you with that in this way, for software.
Right.
Um, and they will be very grateful for that.
Yeah, I fully agree. Also from the context that we all have our biases, right? All of us are standing in some kind of a
Yes.
box, is what I always say. And in order to sort of be able to step out of that, even for them, like when they come to us with business requirements, a lot of those requirements are really solutions. They're not really the requirements or the problems to begin with, because they are also operating out of a context. Maybe there is already an application, and like you said, because they don't have our skills and they don't know what software can do, they don't have sufficient distance to be able to step outside of that context and say, well, these are all of the possible ways that this could be solved. So that's also why it's our responsibility as software professionals to try to always dig a little bit deeper when they say, oh, I want you to add this field over there. It's like, okay, why do you need that there? Like, what's the problem that you're trying to solve? What friction are you encountering? What is the underlying reasoning? Because many of the times they also come to us with solutions.
Yeah, that is find the problem. Not oh, you want an Excel file, here you go.
It's another thing I'm very passionate about. So,
I think we're passionate about the same things. um we're almost at the end of the podcast. Is always sort of end in a similar way. So first is rant away. So event-driven architecture has been around for a while now. But what are some of the problems you still notice or the frustrations with software developers around that topic?
so I would say like it would be the versioning angle, which is exactly why I've sort of, you know, sort of dove into the topic a lot more and am spending a lot more attention to that, because there are many parts that we've improved even over the last few years. I remember like at a time where I was building systems, and I was incredibly frustrated about debugging these. Like, how do I, like, there's so many components and I don't even know where to start. And now observability brings, a good answer to that, not only in distributed tracing, but across all of the observability signals. And I really do believe that, with schema registries and centralized schema registries specifically, we will provide a better answer to also the versioning of our systems and the evolution of our systems in the longer term, which I think is now still one of the biggest pain points, where you like, okay, we publish a new event and, half of the system is breaking elsewhere. Oh, that was not the intent. Well, hopefully not, but
Yeah, I am looking forward how that's going to evolve over time, because it was a pain point. Yes.
yeah.
And so as a final question, the podcast is called Satisfying Software. So what does satisfying software look like for you?
I may have an unpopular answer to this question.
Shoot.
Satisfying software to me is software that is still running in production 10 years after it was initially written.
Okay, I can see why that is going to be unpopular, maybe.
I know, but I mean, that's really the sort of proof that your design was good and that, your architectural choices stood the test of time, if you will. And I keep saying, like, our job is not to come in and continuously build new systems that, deprecate older ones and reinvent the wheel. Our goal is to solve business problems in the best way that we can. And that doesn't always necessarily mean to rewrite everything. So, in my opinion, when I look back at the most impactful projects in my career, it's the ones that are still standing years after I left. Because I think that says something about, the quality of the solution that we built as a team.
I can see that. Yeah, it's a wonderful answer. But yeah, maybe some people will not agree. But I agree with your assessment there. So thank you very much for joining us, for having this lovely conversation with me.
Thank you so much for
And
having me.
thank you,
It was a
and
pleasure.
thank you, listeners, for tuning in again. And I will see you at the next episode. Bye.
Bye.